Today I want to talk about Joseph reveals himself. And in our passage, we have three conversations. The first one is Joseph spoke to his brothers, verse 1 to 15. The second one is Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, verses 16 to 24. And the last one is the brothers spoke to Jacob, their father. So let's go back to the first one. Joseph spoke to his brothers. I want you to notice that he prepared the setting carefully. Joseph knew something about himself. He knew that inside of himself were emotions that were really bottled up. Have you ever bottled up your emotions? And after about 20 years, 25 years almost, of bottled up emotions, Joseph knew he wouldn't be able to handle all those emotions. So he prepared a setting very carefully. He told his attendants to leave, and everybody that was supposed to be in the room left the room except for who? Except for his brothers. He was alone with his brothers, and then he told them who he was. Notice it took them a while to catch on. The first thing he says to them is, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? And then it says in verse 3, but his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. They had already been going through guilt feelings. They had already been struggling with, what did we do to our brother so many years ago? And now they are face to face with him. What are they going to do? Then after he prepares the setting, he speaks to them privately. And I want you to notice the next thing that he says to his brothers. It's very simple. Come close to me. Now, when we say things to each other, we say, are you close to your family? What do we mean by saying that? We mean, he shared the news about himself. I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Remember me? He didn't say that, but he could have. He tried to help them handle the news. Notice what he tells them. Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves. You did something wrong. You know it. I know it. We all know it. You did something wrong. But I am not here, Joseph says, to condemn you. I am not here to say, naughty, naughty, naughty. You got caught. I'm Joseph. You just bow down to me. Remember my dreams? He doesn't do that. What does he do? He encourages them. He tells them not to be distressed or angry with themselves. And then he tells them the reason for the whole experience. And the fact that Joseph knows the reason tells me something about Joseph. Joseph has spent time alone with God to figure out what God's purpose was for all that he was experiencing. Now, nobody here has perfect experiences. You all have ups and downs, right? I do, you do. But have you ever spent time alone with God and said, God, is there something that you're teaching me with my health situation? Is there something that you're teaching me in my family situation? Is there something that you're teaching me in my job situation? Whatever it is, Lord, is there something that you are teaching me that I need to get through my head? And if there is, please help me to understand it. I think that's what Joseph did. Because when the brothers came back, Joseph was very quiet. He didn't want to talk to them right away. But he's processing the fact that they're present. And he's processing the fact that he needs to reintroduce himself to them. And he gets to the point where he's ready to reintroduce himself to them, and he's ready to tell them with an answer the purpose that God sent him there. Notice what he says. God sent me here for a purpose, to save lives. That's what it's all about. To save life. You are here at Baptist Temple for a purpose. We are here together at Baptist Temple for a purpose. To reach out to our families and our friends and our people that we know and to save lives. No, let's get this straight. I cannot save anybody. You cannot save anybody. But God wants to save people, and he wants to save them by using us to do his will. And Joseph said, God brought me here for a purpose, and my purpose is to save lives. And in his case, it was from hunger. Then he shared news about the famine. His brothers didn't realize what they were getting into. But Joseph understood. It has been, this famine has been with us for 2 years. And it will continue for 5 years longer. And he shared the news about God's purpose again. Look at this. God sent me ahead of you to save lives. God made me like a father to Pharaoh. In other words, Joseph was actually used as a slave to give advice to Pharaoh, the leader of the country. And now Pharaoh has made him second to himself. And Joseph says, he's made me like a father to Pharaoh. I'm the one that gave Pharaoh advice about how to deal with a 7-year famine that was going to come up. God had a purpose in all of this. And I would like to suggest to you something. That whatever you're struggling with, maybe it's a family issue. Maybe it's a personal issue. But whatever you are struggling with, God has a purpose. And it's your duty as a Christian to go before God and say, okay, God, I'm going to shut up. And I'm going to actually listen to you. And I want to hear you explain to me, what is your purpose for what's going on in my life right now? How can I fit into your purpose? How can I be realize my living according to your purpose? And when you understand your purpose in God's greater plan, you feel much better about how life is going. It might not be going all the best, but you feel much better about it. I remember, I told you a little bit about it already. I remember Friday. Friday was a tough day for me. I was doing a whole bunch of things, and it seemed like I never got to the end. And 12 o'clock noon came, and Eiley wasn't finished her stuff either. So we worked till 12:30, and Eiley left, and then I was working till 1, and I thought, I'm going to go have lunch, because my tummy was telling me it needed it. But wouldn't you know that right at 1 o'clock, I got phone calls. So I was continuing to work until 2 o'clock. And then I said, remember now, I'm hungry. I need to go get something to eat. And I ran over to Taco Bell. And wouldn't you know it was that time exactly when God had that security guard at a relaxed time in his job when he could sit down and talk to me. And I didn't really start it, except I asked him how he was doing. I didn't really start anything, but he wanted to talk to somebody. And he sat down and talked with me. He found out I was a pastor, and he told me a whole bunch of things that I wouldn't just say to somebody I'm going to talk about, but he needed somebody to talk to. And I thought, you know what, Lord? I might be slow, but I'm starting to get it. It wasn't your time for me to leave for lunch at 12. It wasn't time for me to leave for lunch at 1. You orchestrated the whole thing so that when Sean was prepared to sit down and talk to me, that's when you had me walk in the door. And I believe that God prepares people for the right time and the right place for the right kind of meeting. And that's why, like I said last week, we need to pray for people before we talk to people about God. So, Joseph had a place for his father to live. He had already planned the land of Egypt. In the land of Egypt, he could come down. The brothers could bring Jacob down to Egypt, and he could stay with him. God has made me Lord of all Egypt. And this is his message for his dad, verse 9. Come down to me. Don't delay. And Joseph had a place for his father to live, verse 10 and 11. You shall live in the region of Goshen. I will provide for you there during the famine. And he told his brothers to testify about the news that he had shared to his brothers. They were to testify about that to their father. You can see for yourselves, he says. Tell my father about this. Bring my father down here quickly. And then starting in verse 14, we find out that Joseph still kind of had a favorite brother. It was Benjamin. And he expressed his love to Benjamin. He got kind of special treatment. But then I want you to notice that in verse 15, he gave love to all of his brothers. Wait a minute. This told me something. These guys were the guys who had thrown Joseph into the pit. These guys were the guys who had sold Joseph as a slave to Egypt. And now, Joseph doesn't have 20 years of bitterness all stored up in his heart. Joseph has forgiven his brothers before he actually met them. And Joseph, when he reveals himself to his brothers, he's willing to give them love. Even though he gives Benjamin special love, he's willing to give love to all of his brothers, no matter what they have done to him. That's special love, isn't it? And it says, verse 15, they talked together. I can only imagine what they talked about. Oh, did you really? How did you survive after you were sent with that caravan of slave traders? Where did you go? What happened? Oh, you were in prison? How did you do? What happened there? All these conversations. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly what they were, but from the rest of the story, we can kind of surmise. They had a great visit. So that was Joseph talking to his brothers. The second part is in verse 16 to 24. Pharaoh talks to Joseph. Now, Joseph had one thing that is very noticeable. He was very emotional about all this. And he not only cried hard and loud, he cried long. And he was extremely emotional about this. He cried so loud that all the people that had been taken out or sent out of the house, even though they had gotten out of the house, they still heard him. He cried so strong that the people who heard him thought that it was serious enough that they reported it to Pharaoh. And all of Pharaoh's household hears about it. So Pharaoh and his officials, verse 16, heard the news. What was all this commotion about, Joseph? What was that? That Joseph's brothers had come all the way from Canaan to get food. And that Joseph was reunited with his brothers. And it says in verse 16, they, that means the officials in Pharaoh's household, they were all pleased. Isn't this wonderful? Joseph, you've been such a great help here in Egypt, and we're thrilled that your family has come to be with you. And then he says something very interesting. Leave your belongings there. Don't worry about packing up everything.